Thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day outside, but we get to be inside now. My name is Jeff Morrison. I'm the author and photographer for two books about architectural sculpture in Michigan. Guardians of Detroit is my first book. It's all architectural sculpture within the city limits of Detroit. It was published by Wayne State University and released in 2019. 333 pages, 750 pictures. It won a State History Award, and it was also a Michigan Notable Book from the Library of Michigan. And my second book is Guardians of Michigan, published by the University of Michigan Press in 2022. It has 466 pages, 1,200 pictures, and it covers architectural sculpture in the rest of Michigan outside of Detroit. It was also a Michigan Notable Book, and it won the Stuart and Verna Gross Award for Literature and Regional History from Saginaw Valley State University. So tonight's presentation will be divided into categories of buildings like skyscraper, bank buildings, houses of worship, school-related buildings, and so on. And I like to talk about the architects, the people that built the building, but mostly focus on the sculpture on the building and the sculptors that created it. If you have any questions during the presentation, please raise your hand. I'd rather answer questions as we go along than try to wait till the end, but there will also be time at the end for questions. So I like to start by asking, who has seen this tiger? Everybody, right? If you've got a TV, watch baseball, or if you've been to a baseball game at Comerica Park, you've seen this tiger. But how many people have seen this fellow? Pretty memorable. If you'd seen him, you'd probably remember that, right? Well, if you've been to a Tigers game at Comerica Park and you crossed Woodward Avenue from near Hockeytown Cafe and walked up to the ballpark, you walked right past this guy. He's on St. John's Episcopal Church, and he's right here. So that helps explain what the Guardians of Detroit, Guardians of Michigan projects are all about, which is finding all these interesting pieces of architectural sculpture that are easily overlooked or in some cases hidden, and bringing them out into the open and up close for everyone to see and appreciate. This is, as I said, St. John's Episcopal Church. It's built in 1861. It's at 2326 Woodward Avenue in Detroit. The architects are Albert H. Jordan and James Anderson, and the sculptor is Walter Schweikert. This looks like a white stone church with black stone trim, and it essentially is now, but all this black stone trim on the church was originally like a mustard yellow gold sandstone, and it's just soaked up so much grime and soot and dirt over the years that it looks black. There is not much architectural sculpture on this side of the church, but there's a lot on the front and on the other side, and that's because when the church was built, there was a parsonage here, and it blocked the view from that side. So if you get a chance to go down there, or you go to a baseball game, maybe go a little early and walk around the church, it's worth it, because it's kind of interesting on the front because a lot of the sculpture is kind of hidden in the dark stone, the sooty stone, and it's like one of those hidden picture games that you look at. The more you look, the more you see. And then the sculpture on the other side, there's quite a bit on the other side, and that's pretty easy to see. This is also an interesting church because the people that, the congregation of the church, when Woodward was widened in the 20s or 30s, the city gave them money to condemn this building and sell their land and build a new church somewhere else. And they loved this church so much that they dismantled the tower, they jacked the church up on jacks and moved it 30 feet back from the road, and then put it back and put everything back together again. Now we are in Bay City, and this is First Presbyterian Church, built in 1893. It's at 805 Center Avenue in Bay City. The architects are Leverett A. Pratt and Walter Keppy. And the sculptor is unknown. And that'll come up on a few of these. A lot of times the sculptors, the architectural sculptors on these buildings, they were not really thought of as artists in most cases. They were just thought of as craftsmen or day laborers, much like the electricians and the bricklayers and everybody else. So a lot of times their names weren't kept. This is another church, a building that helps to explain what I had to do with the Guardians of Michigan project, which is go to every city. I can do a lot of research online. There's a lot of books about architectural sculpture and cities that'll show, in Michigan, that'll show their buildings and their history, but there's no substitute for going to the city. I knew of some buildings in Bay City, and I'd gone and photographed those, and I was at the Masonic Temple, and I looked down the road and saw the tower of this church, and I didn't know anything about it, but I looked and I thought, well, it looks old enough and it looks like the right type of style of architecture that maybe there's some architectural sculpture on it. So I went and took a closer look, and all this beautiful sculpture on this church. Mostly guardian figures, grotesques to ward off evil spirits, but also this interesting piece up at the top with the man and the woman representing the members of the church. And they have those like lion heads on their heads. And that's part of what gets me interested in this, is why do they do that sort of thing? And this is to represent that the Word of God comes forth from His followers like the mighty roar of a lion. And now we're looking at Fort Street Presbyterian Church. This is built in 1855 at 631 West Fort Street in Detroit. The architects are Albert H. Jordan and James Anderson, and the sculptor is unknown. And these 5 pictures down here are all from the west side of the church. And I was taking pictures along the west side of the church, and I thought, well, maybe there's some interesting sculpture on the other side of the church, because typically if it's on one side, it's on the other. But after the church was built, they built this, what's called a church house. You can kind of see it in the shadows there. It's a community center with a gymnasium, an auditorium, classrooms, things like that. That hides the west side of the church, or the east side of the church. So I called the church and asked, is there sculpture on the east side of the church? And they said, well, yes, there is, but you have to go into the church house to see it. So I got permission, and you go into the church house and up to the second floor. And you look out the windows and you can see some of it, but you can't see all of it unless you climb out the window and go onto the roof. But then you can't see all of it unless you go down to the south end, and there's a wall with a ladder into the wall, a steel ladder into the wall, and you climb up that and you can see the rest of the sculpture. And a smart person would have done that on a day like today. I did it in February. Kind of cold and rainy, but it's worth it because those first 3 on the top and the one on the left in the middle, all those faces, sculpture on that church, haven't been seen by people on the street for more than 100 years. So again, that's what the Guardians of Michigan, Guardians of Detroit projects are all about, is to bring these pieces of sculpture out into the open for everyone to see and appreciate. Now we're up in the Upper Peninsula, in the UP at St. Peter Cathedral at 311 West Baraga Street in Marquette, built in 1890 and 1938. The architects are Henry C. Koch and Son from 1890 and Edward A. Schilling from 1938, and the sculptor is Corrado Parducci. And the reason there's 2 dates for when this church was built was because in 1935 there was a big fire, and it destroyed most of the church except for the stone walls. And they rebuilt, they made it bigger and better. Originally there was a rose window here, and they extended that part upward and put this triforate arch. By triforate arch you can see there's 3 arched windows with an arch over them. And they added that on, and they made the towers taller and put those colorful domes on them. And here's a closer look at one of the angels on the dome, and you can see that the wings were painted gold, and that was something that happened with sculpture on buildings quite a bit, was that it was painted or gilded. And then inside the triforate arch we can see statues of St. Peter and St. Paul. And how do we know they're St. Peter and St. Paul? Well, it says St. Peter and St. Paul right below him. But you don't always get labels on churches, on the sculpture on the outside of a church. A lot of times you're expected to know by what's called the attributes of the saints. Well, what they're holding helps define who they are, helps tell us who they are. So you can see St. Peter is holding a key, and St. Paul is holding a sword. When he's holding the sword at the side like that, point down, that represents how he was martyred by the Romans. They used a sword to cut his head off. But when he's holding the sword over his head, that represents his role as defender of the faith. And sticking with houses of worship, but not actually a church, this is the Pashumakasi Sri Vishwanath Temple, built in 2015 at 1147 South Elms Road in Flint, Michigan. And the architect and sculptor are unknown. The church was built, or the temple was built following guidelines from ancient Hindu texts. And two sculptors came over from India and lived there for about a year and a half to sculpt all these figures that are in the tower. The tower is a 65-foot high tower. It's called a Gopuram. And there's 126 different deities on the tower in all the niches. They're on all four sides of the tower. And here's a closer look at some of them. And we look at this and we think of this as a polytheistic religion. But this is a Shaivist temple, which means they worship Shiva as the main god, as their god, the main god of their temple. And in their belief, all these different deities are actually aspects of Shiva, parts of Shiva, sent down to earth to perform a certain job or function, take care of a troublesome demon, or help somebody out or something like that. And we're going to finish up churches and houses of worship with a look at Christ Church, Cranbrook, built in 1929 at 470 Church Road in Bloomfield Hills. The architect's Oscar H. Murray, and the sculptors are Lee Lowry and Ulrich Ellerhausen. So George Booth married Ellen Scripps. Ellen Scripps was the daughter of Detroit News founder and publisher James Scripps. And then George Booth took over as publisher of the newspaper when James retired. And then George went around Michigan and had a chain of newspapers around Michigan. And we'll look at some of his buildings later. But the result was that he and Ellen were two of the richest people in Detroit. And they wanted to give away all their money before they died, so they could see, they wanted to give it away while they were still alive so they could see how it was used, direct how it was used, make sure it was being used effectively. They founded Cranbrook Educational Community, which is right up the road here. They founded the Cranbrook Institute of Science, the Institute of Arts, and they provided the property to build Christ Church on. And one of the interesting things about this church is some of the sculpture on it by Lee Lowry and Ulrich Ellerhausen. Lee Lowry was born with the name Hugo Belling, that's him on the left, in 1877 in Rixdorf, Prussia. Came to America in 1881 with his mother, and she married a man named Charles Lowry. And Hugo eventually changed his name to Lee Lowry so he'd have a more American-sounding name. And he worked continuously as a sculptor from the time he was 14 years old until just 8 days before his death in 1963. He was responsible for over 300 commissions around the United States. His masterpiece is probably the Nebraska State Capitol building, which has a lot of sculpture on it. He also, we probably all have a piece of his work. If not in our pockets or our purses at home. He did the sculpture of Franklin Roosevelt for the dime. So we've all seen and carried his art around with us. And then on the right is Ulrich Ellerhausen, who was born in Germany in 1879, came to the U.S. in 1894, studied under Laredo Taft, who was one of the most popular American sculptors of his era. Also Gutzon Borglum. Does that name mean anything to anybody? He's the man responsible for Mount Rushmore. He also worked with the Austrian-American sculptor Karl Bitter, who did a lot of work in Cleveland, in and around Cleveland, and some in New York. So the two of them created 18 figures on the outside of the church that are known as the Dawn Men. And they were called the Dawn Men. They were chosen by church leadership because they brought the light of truth to the world. So here's figures from the north side of the church. Here on the left, all these figures on the north side advanced religious beliefs and principles. So here on the left is Phillips Brooks, a theologian, wrote the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. There at the top is Abraham Lincoln, believed in the freedom and dignity of man. William Penn founded the Pennsylvania colony, helped write the Constitution. And then this one here is John Wycliffe, who was the first translator of the Bible into English. You can see the book he's holding representing his English Bible. And then on the far right is Thomas Cranmer, a leader of the Protestant Revolution in England, who was burned at the stake by Bloody Queen Mary during the Catholic Restoration of 1556. But now on the south side of the church is something unique for a church, which is these are all secular figures instead of religious figures. And they were chosen because they advanced scientific thought and principles in the face of opposition from religious and secular leaders. So does anybody know who this is on the far left holding a propeller? That's Wilbur Wright, one of the Wright brothers. And then we have Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man. And then this is Galileo, who was persecuted by the Italian Inquisition for proclaiming or espousing the doctrine, the crazy, crazy doctrine that the earth revolved around the sun instead of the sun revolving around the earth. And so he's usually shown holding a model of the solar system with the sun in the middle and the earth going around. He's also usually shown with a telescope. He didn't create or invent the telescope, but he refined it and he used it to make a lot of interesting discoveries about our solar system. And then here on the right are four heads of Native Michigan animals from the bell tower. And I include them just because I like the way they look, especially that really angry-looking bunny rabbit up at the top. And then we have the otter, and then the portrait of a fish. You don't see too many fish portraits on churches anywhere. So now we're going to move on to Albert Kahn designed newspaper buildings. All of these buildings were built for George Booth. Well, this one for James Scripps and George Booth as publisher of the Detroit News. And when George Booth created this chain of newspapers across the state of Michigan, he had Albert Kahn design new buildings for all of them. The Detroit News building was built in 1917. It's at 615 West Lafayette Boulevard in Detroit. Architects Albert Kahn. And the sculpture on the building is attributed to Alessio Ricci and John Donnelly. And you can see figures up at the top representing the history of publishing. And then there's some neat cartouches at the corners. And then in the spaces between the windows, we have printer's marks. So there's one of the cartouches at the corner. Each corner has the same cartouche on both sides of the corner. You have the owl at the top representing wisdom, which hopefully guides the writers and editors of the newspaper. And then you have the eagle holding the Constitution, representing freedom of the press. And then here on the right is Johannes Gutenberg, one of the four historic figures, brought the movable type printing press to Europe. And then in the middle is two of the printer's marks. And in medieval times, when the printing press and movable type were first widely popular, you couldn't just, like in America, you can decide, well, I want to open a printing plant and publish books or a newspaper or whatever. Well, in medieval times, you couldn't do that. You had to have the permission of the rulers in your area to become a publisher. And one of the ways you showed that you had that permission was by putting your printer's mark on the first page of the book. And that was registered with the local rulers. So this is the printer's mark. A lot of times they play on words or some other sort of interesting story to go with them. This is a printer's mark of Aldus Manutius, whose slogan was, "Make haste slowly," which was work quickly but carefully. So he has the swift swimming dolphin wrapped around the anchor. And then up on the top is the printer's mark of Christopher Froschover. Froschover in German means frog over. So you see him sitting on the frog, and then the two little frogs represent his sons who worked with him in the business. And then when he died, their sons had a printer's mark with just the two frogs on the side and took out the frog in the middle. Now we're looking at the Jacksonville Citizen Patriot, or Jackson Citizen Patriot, now known as the Albert Kahn Apartments, built in 1927 at 214 South Jackson Street. Architect Albert Kahn, and the sculptor is Corrado Parducci. And we'll talk more about Corrado Parducci eventually. You're going to hear that name a lot. It's hard to talk about architectural sculpture in Detroit or Michigan without talking about Corrado Parducci. So as you can see, this newspaper is called the Citizen Patriot. And what George Booth would do was when he would go into a town and he'd buy the leading newspaper. And if there were two competing newspapers that were about equal, he'd buy them both and merge them. Or he'd buy the other newspapers and just put them out of business. Because he thought that having more than one newspaper in a town was not only bad for business, it just was bad for the people too. Because people would get upset and argue in the newspapers. And as long as someone like him could be trusted, fair and impartial, and own the only newspaper in town, what could go wrong? So you have some interesting sculpture at the ends and in the middle on this building. Here in the middle is the state seal of Michigan, surrounded by grotesque masks to ward off evil spirits and owls to represent wisdom. And then at either end of the building, on the piers at either end, you have these two figures, the one with the scroll and the pen representing the people that write and report and edit the news, the intellectual work of the news. And then the man with the mortar and pestle for grinding pigment, representing the people that do the physical labor of producing the newspaper. And if you're wondering why a Midwestern newspaper building has Egyptian figures on the outside of it, it's because of something that happened in 1922. Howard Carter discovered King Tut's tomb. So there was a big craze for everything Egyptian. People were very interested, not only in America, but in Europe. So this is a very stylish choice to put Egyptian figures on the building. And now we're in Muskegon. This is the Muskegon Chronicle building, built in 1928, 981 3rd Street in Muskegon. The architect's Albert Kahn, sculptor Corrado Parducci, that name again. It's now part of the Muskegon Community College Technology Center. And you can see we've been going in chronological order. And you can see they're all designed by Albert Kahn, but his style is getting a little more modern with each building we look at. Instead of freestanding pillars or attached pillars, they're more like indicated pillars in the piers, with the fluting in the piers of the building. And then in the spandrels, the spaces between the windows, little less ornate carving on them. These are all printer's marks. So here's a look at all the different printer's marks on this building. And this represents one of the problems of doing this project. I have several books and several online sources for determining who all these different printer marks belong to. But I could not find these two. I could find some that were very similar, but they had different letters on them. And then while doing research, I came across a copy of the Muskegon Chronicle newspaper for when the building was opened and dedicated, and he explained who all the printer's marks belonged to. And these two belonged to the people that I thought, except they had changed the letters to MC to represent Muskegon Chronicle. And now you can see a much more modern looking building. This is the Ann Arbor News building, built 8 years after Muskegon Chronicle in 1936. 340 East Huron Street in Ann Arbor. You can see it's now the University of Michigan Credit Union building. Much more modern building, still kind of a indication or a memory of Romanesque design to it, but you have a little bit of fluting on the piers to represent pillars, but a very high contrast, white, light colored limestone and dark granite in the spandrels, and then using aluminum, brushed aluminum for some of the highlights, including the sculpture in the spandrels. And here's a closer look at that sculpture. And this is also sculpture by Corrado Parducci. This is one of the few times that Parducci's work was produced in metal. There's also, if you look at the lettering style, this inline lettering style, this was a style that Parducci used fairly regularly. So if you're walking down Detroit or around Ann Arbor where he used some of this type and you see this inline type on a building, you can tell whoever you're with that that sculpture was done by Corrado Parducci, and you're 99% chance of being right. And now we're going to step back just a little bit to look at the Kalamazoo Gazette building, which is now the Bronson Healthcare Group building, built in 1925 at 401 South Burdick Street in Kalamazoo. Designed by Albert Kahn, sculpture by Corrado Parducci, and possibly also by Ulysses Ritchie. We've been looking at these in chronological order, as I said, but take a step back now to 1925. And you can see one of the things that's interesting about this building is one of the things that architects did was to define for the pedestrians where the entrance to the building was. They would do a little more elaborate sculpture or ornamentation on the outside of the building there. So here you have these two sculptures up there by the roof, but there's no entrance. And that's because the building was expanded about 15 years after it was built, and they moved the main entrance around the side, but they didn't move the two sculptures. So here's a closer look at the two of them. The woman with the pen representing the recording of history, and the woman with the hourglass representing the passage of time. And you have a couple more gargoyles. These are actual gargoyles. You can see that water comes out of their mouths. They're along the roof line. That's the difference between gargoyles and grotesque. It's not necessarily the whole body thing. Gargoyles have a practical function of working like rainspouts to channel water away from the wall of the building to keep it from being damaged. And grotesques are more ornamentation. And then a couple more printer's marks. But what makes this building really unique is it has a series of allegorical animal-based sculptures on the outside of it representing the role of the newspaper in society. So up here in the upper left, you can see that staff up in the corner with the two snakes on it. That's a caduceus. We look at that and think of it as a medical symbol, but it's really not. It's the staff of the Roman god Mercury, who was the god, not only the messenger god, but also the god of commerce. So when you see that staff in sculpture on a building, it represents commerce, not medical representation. And then you have the wolf in front of it, and this represents the newspaper's role in safeguarding society from unscrupulous businessmen and business practices. And then you have the owl with the snake representing the triumph of knowledge over the treachery of ignorance. You have the lion guarding the lamp of knowledge, and then you have a wolverine with a fish in its mouth representing the newspaper's role to help safeguard Michigan's natural resources. And now we're going to move on from the newspaper buildings to skyscraper bank buildings. This is the Second National Bank building, built in 1925 at 101 North Washington Avenue in Saginaw. Architects Wirt C. Rowland, and the sculptor is Corrado Parducci. I think of Wirt Rowland as like Detroit's other great architect. Everybody's heard of Albert Kahn, and rightly so, because he has done a lot of work in and around Detroit and around the world. Wirt C. Rowland also designed some of Detroit's most iconic buildings. He designed the Buell Building, the Penobscot Building, the Guardian Building. Designed this building. So you look at the outside of it, and it looks very shiny and gleaming like it's highly polished stone. And it's actually not. It's actually terracotta. Excuse me. Which is fired clay with a glaze on it, specially developed glaze for this building to look more like stone. Terracotta was easier to use than stone, easier to form than stone, more consistent than stone, and more durable than stone. So it became a very popular building material for the outside of some of these taller buildings. And then you can see also like these little guys here, that's what these are up here, all the way across there. So instead of carving each one of those out of stone, they could make one, make a mold, and then easily replicate those over and over. So much less expensive to put interesting architectural sculpture on the outside of the building. This piece here is up in that corner there. Now, another one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, why do they put so much sculpture on a building like this up so high where you can barely see it without a telephoto lens or binoculars? And the answer is that skyscraper was a whole new concept in building. But all the architects, or most of the architects in America, they were trained in European styles of architecture, which called for a base, a middle, and a top. And at the top, you put architectural sculpture. You put representational sculpture up there. So that slowly changed over time, but that's why there's so much sculpture so high up. Here's a closer look at some of the sculpture on the building. You have portraits of ancient kings representing the wealth and power of ancient kingdoms, appropriate for a bank. You have griffins. Griffins are mythological guardians of treasure. You have the state seal with the word Tubor on it, I will defend. So you know your money's safe there. And then you have the Roman god Mercury here with his caduceus on his forehead. And just so you understand, it's about commerce. He's holding stacks of money. And then a guardian griffin as well. And now we're looking at the Guardian building. It's built in 1929 at 500 Griswold Street in Detroit. The architect's Wirt C. Rowland. Sculptor is Corrado Parducci. This is one of the most interesting buildings in Detroit. Wirt Rowland saw it as a cathedral of commerce. So he gathered like a small army of different kinds of craftsmen. If you get a chance to go inside this building, there is all kinds of great marble work and mosaics and stained glass and etched steel and special kinds of metal, Monel metal used in there. So it's really interesting to look at. And one more way that he kind of subtly defined it as a cathedral of commerce is with these figures on the outside. The style is kind of a Aztec Mayan sensibility to it with the stepped arches and everything, and these kind of Mayan Aztec figures on either side, guardian figures on either side of the entrance. But you can notice that the one on the left is holding the key like St. Peter, and the one on the right is holding a sword like St. Paul. So it kind of subtly, even though they're not meant to represent the saints, it represents the idea that this is a cathedral of finance. And there's a closer look at one of the figures. And then here on the right is Corrado Parducci, who I said we would talk about a little bit more. He was born in 1900 in a little town called Buti, just a little north of Pisa in Italy. He came to New York City with his father in 1904. And his father was working to bring the rest of the family over from Italy, so he put little 4-year-old Corrado Parducci in an orphanage to be taken care of. And so when they finally got the rest of the family over there, Corrado no longer spoke English. He needed a translator to be able to talk with the rest of his family. But he was, even from a very early age, showed artistic talent. And a woman named Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney had a program in Detroit to find young artists. She was an artist in her own right, a philanthropist. She also founded the Whitney Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So she sent people out into the city to find young people with talent and then paid for their education to be further educated in the arts. And Corrado Parducci was one of the people that got to do this. And he also, he worked at the firm that Albert Kahn most often contracted with for sculpture on his buildings. And he became Albert Kahn's favorite sculptor. Albert Kahn would specify that he wanted Corrado Parducci to work on his buildings. And one of the reasons why was it was a transition time in this kind of work. It used to be that architects would do very detailed scale drawings of the sculpture that they wanted to put on the building and expect the stone carvers to follow that. But with Corrado Parducci and his generation of sculptors and the ones just before, they were so well educated in the arts that they there would be an indication. The architect would give a rough drawing of what they wanted or a verbal description of what they wanted, and then trust the sculptors, and especially trust Corrado Parducci to do this kind of work. Albert Kahn, actually, some of the plans that are in the files at the museum in Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan, they have spots on there where instead of doing a drawing of what he wanted, he just wrote Parducci in that space. Trust, meaning that he would trust Parducci to come up with something. So Parducci came to Detroit in 1924. He'd done some models for the sculpture for some bank buildings that Kahn had designed in Detroit. And Kahn brought him here. The way they would work, Parducci would do the sculpture in clay, and then they'd make a plaster cast of it and send that cast to the stone yard, and there would be stone cutters that would do the final work in stone. And they were doing this up on scaffolding in the middle of winter, and Kahn brought Parducci here to supervise that work. And while he was here, Parducci got so many offers of work that he never went back to New York City. He stayed in Detroit, sent for his wife to join him. He worked very, very hard, was a workaholic, often slept at his studio, only saw his family on the weekends. And so almost, not every building, but just about every building that went up in Detroit and around Detroit from 1924 to 1925 on into the 30s and even the 40s, if it had sculpture in it or on it, it was most likely done by Corrado Parducci. And then this is a look at the dome, the half-dome entrance to the Guardian building. This is all Pewabic pottery tile over the entrance. And Pewabic pottery did not have enough room in their studio to produce this. So they they put a tent out on the front lawn and dug a big round hole in the front yard. And as they fired and finished the clay tiles, they assembled them within this hole in the front yard and then brought them to the Guardian building and put them up on the building. And then you can see these medallions on the inside of the dome representing industry, agriculture, and transportation. And there's a closer look at those. And now we're looking at the People's State Bank, also known as the Oakland Town Center in Pontiac, built in 1929 at 28 North Saginaw Street. The architect's J.W. Cook Company Incorporated. The sculptor is unknown. And I told you it's People's State Bank or Oakland Town Center. At the time it was built, it was called the house that junk built. And that's because it was built by a man named Jacob Kowinski. Jacob Kowinski was a Polish immigrant who came to North America with his family in 1894, came to Pontiac around 1900 when he was 17 or 18 years old, and all he had was a wagon, a blind horse, and $231 in his pocket. And he started a business, a rag and bone business. He was a trash man, basically, going around collecting trash and recyclable materials, iron and steel and stuff like that. And he built a business so that by 1918 he was a millionaire. And he helped found People's State Bank in 1922, and he saw the construction of this building as his crowning achievement. So there's these great figures way up at the top, and they're kind of interesting to me because they're such a conglomeration of different styles of clothing on them. It's Egyptian and Native American and Proto-American, South American figures. You have a flock of 18 eagles around the top of the building representing the dollar and also protection for the building. And then right here above the entrance, you have a portrait of Chief Pontiac, for whom the city of Pontiac was named. And now we're in Battle Creek. And this is the old Merchants Tower, also called the Milton, now called the Milton, built in 1931 at 25 West Michigan Avenue in Battle Creek. The architects are Weary and Alford Company, and the sculptor is unknown. And this building was the first bank anywhere in the world to feature something called an automatic stair climber. You know what that is? An escalator, exactly. There's an old wooden escalator still inside this building. They can't use it anymore because it's not up to code, but it does actually still work, but it's covered up. Weary and Alford, banks would build these buildings. They would put their banking floor on the ground floor, and then up above would be offices they'd lease out, and then other space on the ground floor would be leased out to retail businesses. So Weary and Alford came up with the idea of, well, why don't we put the banking floor up on the second floor, then we can lease out all the ground floor space for businesses, make more money for the bank. So they did that, and then to make it easier for their customers to get up to the bank, they put in the escalators. So here's a look at some of the sculpture on the building. Weary and Alford have kind of a unique style of sculpture on their buildings, where this is called incised relief sculpture, where lines are carved into the stone to make the image. And then this is called bas relief, where the image comes out, especially with the eagle, where the image comes out from the stone. And they did this kind of interesting combination of the two styles of sculpture that you see on most Weary and Alford buildings. And now we're in Lansing. This is a City National Bank, built in 1932 at 101 North Washington Square in Lansing. The architects are Lee and Kenneth Black, and the sculptor is Ulysses Ritchie. This is Ulysses Ritchie here. I think we mentioned his name in connection with the Kalamazoo, the newspaper building in Kalamazoo. He was born in New York in 1888 to Italian immigrant parents. And he believed that he had been a sculptor all his life, that he came from a long line of Italian sculptors and potters. He remembered in an interview, he remembered holding clay in his hands and sculpting when he was 6 years old. And he was accepted at Drexel Institute in Philadelphia when he was 11 years old on the basis of samples that he sent to the Institute. And then he got there and they said, go home, you're 11 years old, you can't come to our school, you're not old enough. So he went home and he apprenticed with his uncle Alicio, who we mentioned in connection with the Detroit News building. And then while he was working in New York as he grew up, his apprentice was Corrado Parducci. So it's kind of interesting to see all the different connections between all these sculptors working on these different buildings. This building has a kind of medieval program of sculpture on the outside of it that represents not only what goes on in the building, but also the city around it. You have these images up at the top, are images from American coins. Most of the spaces upstairs in the tower were rented to dentists and doctors. So you have these corbels representing that. This is one of the windows. In the corner of the window, you sculpture on one side, you have the man with the pliers, a dentist, and then on the other side there's a patient with a bandage wrapped around his head and swollen cheeks. There's another window that has a bank robber on one side and a policeman on the other side. You have the cat representing the protective Egyptian goddess Bastet. You have images on each side of the door that we'll take a closer look at in a minute. And then you have over the doorway, you have this seahorse flagpole holder. And again, I look at something like that and wonder why a seahorse. Well, they represent power and good fortune. So a good image to have on your bank. Along with the elephant, which represents strength and steadfastness. They use that as a logo on their letterhead, that elephant. And then on either side of the doorway, the capitals and the reveals on either side of the doorway, they have these figures up at the top, and on the one side, person riding a seahorse, hippocampus, representing, and then waterfowl and water plants representing wealth from the rivers and the lakes, and on the other side are images representing wealth from the land. You have the man holding the Capitol Dome representing Lansing's role as the state capital of Michigan. This is kind of an interesting piece of work here. This is a wolverine, sculpted by someone who had never seen a wolverine, holding some kind of odd creature in its mouth. And then over the doorway, you have the central figure representing the law, and then on either side, the bulls representing a profitable bull market. There were shops at the lower levels and above. This is a merchant from one of the shops. This man's holding a thermometer, a doctor representing the people upstairs. And then over the employees' entrance, you have these scary dragons to ward off bad employees. And now we're going to look at school buildings, educational buildings. This is J.W. Sexton High School in Lansing, built in 1943 at 102 McPherson Street in Lansing. The architect's the Warren S. Holmes Company. The sculptor, once again, is Corrado Parducci. I mentioned it was built in 1943. There's nearly 60 individual pieces of sculpture on the exterior of this building. And it was one of the last of Corrado Parducci's really big commissions, because styles changed so much after that, and people were no longer putting sculpture on buildings like this. But there's some great sculpture by the door. You have figures, the two at the top representing athletic pursuits of the students, and then academic pursuits also. And then on the outside of the auditorium, you have this great piece of students performing. Now we're in the Upper Peninsula, all the way at the western end of the Upper Peninsula, almost to Wisconsin, actually. And this is the Wakefield High School Gymnasium, built in 1932, 715 Putnam Street in Wakefield. The architect's Warren S. Holmes Company with N.A. Nelson. And the building is at the western end of the UP, as I said. And the sculptor is unknown. And here's the sculpture over the entrance. It's right in this space, representing the activities that take place in the gymnasium. And it's kind of an interesting style of sculpture where you have, it's kind of flat looking but dimensional, where you have multiple planes to build up the figures, but it's still sort of geometric. And you see this on several different schools around the Upper Peninsula, all designed by the Holmes Company. And I could not find out who the sculptor was for this. I couldn't find any information for that. But so I don't know, did they just draw this style of line work in on their buildings and have different stone carvers do it, or did they have the same sculptor work on all these different buildings? But here's a couple other examples of that sculpture. This is from Ontonagon, from a school in Ontonagon. This is from a school in Ishpeming, and then these two are from Negaunee. And you can see, especially these two pieces here, the similarity besides just the stylistic similarities. And now we're at the Olin Memorial Health Center at Michigan State University in East Lansing. Built in 1939, 463 East Circle Drive in East Lansing. The architect's Ralph R. Calder, and the sculptor for the health center, smoking a cigarette, is Samuel Cashwan. So he was born in 1899 in Cherkasy in the Ukraine, came with his family to New York City in 1906, and they moved to Detroit in 1916. He studied at the Architectural League in New York, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He was the head of the sculpture department at the Society of Arts and Crafts in Detroit, which later became the College for Creative Studies. And in 1935, he was named sculpture supervisor for the Michigan Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which was a Depression-era program to provide work for people in all different walks of life, including artists. And this sculpture on this building was done as under the auspices of that program. I think, as a matter of fact, I think the whole program, the whole building was done under part of that program. So here's a closer look at the sculpture on either sides of the doorway representing the history of medicine. You have magical healing, herbal healing, consultation or diagnosis where people work together to figure out what's wrong, and a little more modern radiology. And there's some of the other pieces. And this is one of the two goddesses over the doorway, Panacea on the left, the goddess of medicinal cures, and Hygeia on the right, the goddess of health and cleanliness. And now we go from Michigan State to the University of Michigan. And this is the William W. Cook Law Quadrangle at the university, built from 1923 to 1933 at 625 South State Street. The architects York and Sawyer, and the sculptors are Ulysses Ritchie, who we mentioned earlier, and Angelo Zari. So it's a huge complex of 4 interconnected buildings. The Lawyers Club is actually 3 buildings itself, with a dining hall and a dormitory wing, and then the clubhouse itself. And this is part of the Lawyers Club, part of the dormitory. There's 3 arched openings. The dormitory runs along State Street for a block, and then there's arched openings into the building. 4 buildings making a square. Why it's called a quadrangle, or the law quad. There's the William P. Cook Legal Research Building, the Law Library. There's Hutchins Hall, and then there's also the John P. Cook Dormitory, named for William Cook's father. William Cook was a graduate, an 1882 graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, and he went to New York City, made a lot of money as a corporate lawyer, invested very wisely, literally wrote the book on corporate law, the book that everyone used, that sold widely. So he was very wealthy, and he wanted to get back to the university and to the law school. He thought that the law students at the University of Michigan were the best and the brightest, and they deserved the best buildings for their education and living space. So he paid to do all this, and it's all, you can see it's kind of an old-fashioned style of architecture. It's called Collegiate Gothic. And the idea was to build these buildings that looked very historical, very European, and give the impression that they had been there for hundreds of years instead of being built in the 1920s and 30s. So here's some figures from the outside of the Lawyers Club dining room. This is from the tower of the Lawyers Club dining room, very churchy looking tower. These are from the John P. Cook dormitory, where you see all these different faces representing the different feelings and emotions that someone might go through as a student at the law school, ending with the tired but satisfied graduate in the corner. These are from the West End, the East End, the tunnel from the East End. There's ribbed arches inside the tunnel, and at the base of each one of these ribs is a corbel representing several different things. One of the Gothic traditions would be to represent the seasons, but they did it here using athletics and then also using agriculture. That's the autumn where he's harvesting grapes. And then there's also figures representing the people it took to build the building. So you have the surveyor, the draftsman, and the architect. And then in that central arch, that long, tall arch that we looked at before, these are the first 6 presidents of the university. And then at the west end of the building, there's figures representing different types of law. You have a navigator up here representing maritime law. You have an engineer representing patent law. You have a soldier representing military law. And then a doctor with the staff of Asclepius representing medical law. And now we are getting close to the end. We're going to look at some county courthouses, starting with the Lenawee County Courthouse, built in 1885 at 309 North Main Street in Adrian. The architect's Edward O. Follis. The sculptor is unknown. This is kind of a typical turn of the century courthouse. When we think of a courthouse, this is kind of what we think of. Some great terracotta sculpture on the outside of it. A portrait of Tecumseh, the first city in Lenawee County was named after Tecumseh, a great Native American leader. You have Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. You have a guardian Medusa, and then over the doorway you have the tools of war and the tools of peace on either side of the doorway. Now we're looking at a completely different type of county courthouse. This is the Midland County Courthouse, built in 1926 at 301 West Main Street in Midland. The architect's Bloodgood Tuttle, and the murals on the building were done by Paul Honore. So in 1907, voters approved a proposal to build a new courthouse, but they didn't approve the funding for the new courthouse. So it didn't get built right away, and finally they were having difficulty raising the money, and finally around 1919, Herbert Dow, founder of Dow Chemical Corporation, said, well, I'll donate the money to finish it up to the rest of the money we need, as long as I can choose the architect and have control over the construction of the building. So that's how you end up with a building that looks like an English country manor rather than a Michigan courthouse as the county courthouse. You have this great seal over the doorway, the seal of the city of, or county of Midland, with the tree representing the lumber industry, the cornucopia representing agriculture. And then in the middle at the bottom is a well for extracting chemicals from the ground. And that's what the basis of Midland County's real money was built on, and the Dow Chemical Corporation was built on extracting these chemicals and creating this chemical industry. But you also have these great murals on the outside of the building, and they're made with a material developed at Dow Labs just for this building called magnesite stucco. And it was a clear material, very durable, very strong. And the artist, Paul Honoré, to add color to it, rather than just adding pigment, he added ground up colored glass. So the color is trapped in the glass and won't fade. So this courthouse is 100 years old, but the colors in the murals are just as bright and as vibrant as the day they were first applied, or almost. And now a completely different type of courthouse building. This is the Macomb County building, built in 1933 at 10 North Main Street in Mount Clemens. The architect's George J. Haas, the sculptor is Louis Seeloff, and this is known as, sometimes called the Mount Rushmore of Mount Clemens, because you have these 13.5-foot tall heads up at the top of the building. This is a closer look at one of them. They're all military in nature to pay honor to Selfridge Air Force Base, which is nearby. This is an officer from the War of 1812. Alexander Macomb, for whom the county was named, was an officer in the War of 1812. You also have a pilot and a sailor, and there's also a Marine and a soldier and a Native American warrior. And then you have these great kind of incised sculptures, combination incised bas-relief sculpture, not a Weary and Elford building, but a unique design representing law, and a record keeper, so representing why people would come to the building. And then we're going to wrap up with just with three buildings that don't really fit the other categories, but I included them just because I like them. This is the Maccabees building, built in 1927 at 5057 Woodward Avenue in Detroit. Designed by Albert Kahn with sculpture by Corrado Parducci. The Maccabees were a fraternal organization in the 1900s, early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. This was the age of the fraternal organization. Everybody belonged to almost everybody belonged to at least one organization. If you worked for Ford Motor Company, you had to be a Mason because Henry Ford was a Mason, so he encouraged membership in the Masons. And this is the Maccabees building. The Maccabees based their structure and their rituals on the story of Judah Maccabee, who led a revolt against the Seleucid Empire in 167 BC. And what was unique about him was that he required his soldiers to set aside parts of their spoils to provide for the families of fallen comrades, kind of like insurance. And as a matter of fact, well, members paid extra dues to provide a death benefit when someone died, and eventually this grew into an insurance company, and that split off from the fraternal organization. So there's quite a bit of military-themed ornamentation on the outside of the building, especially around the entrance. You have these cavalry soldiers in the area riding over the arch. You have these medallions on either side with guardian figures. And then you have these knights over the doorway, and then you have these great figures on either side of the door representing Judah Maccabee and his family. They're about this tall. And very detailed, very interesting work. I think of this as, I like this building a lot. I just think it's some of Parducci's finest work in Detroit. But there's also all these other pieces of sculpture, protective pieces. You can see the man hugging the building, the man with the bow and arrow protecting the building, the man with the sword guarding the safe. Very interesting building. And now we're looking at the Michigan Bell Central office in Grand Rapids at 114 Division Avenue Northeast, built in 1925. The architect's Wirt Rowland, who we talked about before. And the sculpture on the building is attributed to Ulysses Ritchie. And this is kind of an interesting building. Michigan Bell expanded very rapidly throughout Michigan in the 1920s. They would either go into a unserved market and take over, or they would buy up existing people. They ended up with a monopoly, more or less, of telephone service in Michigan. So every town that they were in, good-sized town, had to have a central office, not just for their offices, but also to house the massive amounts of switching equipment that was needed. So they hired Wirt Rowland to design all these different offices. And rather than take a cookie-cutter approach where every building looks the same, he designed buildings that fit in with the neighborhood. Across the street from where this church was built, or where this building was built, is a Romanesque church. So this is based on a Romanesque palace, designed to look like a Romanesque palace, except for that ugly addition that was slapped on top a few years after it was built, kind of ruins the effect. So here's a closer look at some of the sculpture on the building. Again, you can see some of it's painted, and I really like these figures here on the right because they remind me of Maurice Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are. And so I wonder if maybe they didn't use the same historical reference for their work. There's also a pretty gruesome ghost story attached to this building, but we're almost out of time, so we can't go into it now, but it is on page 171 of the Guardians of Michigan book, if anyone's interested. We're going to finish up by looking at the Ford Engineering Laboratory, built in 1924 at 21500 Oakwood Boulevard in Dearborn. Again, Albert Kahn's the architect. Sculpture on the building is attributed to Ulysses Ritchie. So, 1903, Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company on the basis of these little vehicles that he built in his garage with the help of one or two assistants. And by 1924, when this building was being built, it was built to house 1,800 of the company's 100,000 employees. So 20 years later, the company is very successful, very huge. You can see how the auto industry grew. This is the engineering laboratory. So there's figures on the outside of the building, high relief sculpture representing the different work of the Ford Motor Company. You have a woman holding the caduceus and a cornucopia full of coins, and a man with the hourglass representing the passage of time, and a globe with wings representing international commerce, and then the owl up on top representing wisdom, and they're all sitting on a Model T Ford. And then here on the right are figures representing agriculture sitting on a Fordson tractor. And then you have a figure holding an airplane. The Ford Motor Company made airplanes and airplane engines, also ships and ship engines, ship motors. This represents wireless communications, pharmaceuticals, transportation, truck transportation, and then over the door, over the entrance, is this cartouche with the words chosen by Henry Ford to represent, to remind the people that worked there of the importance of the work they did. And this picture here is a close-up of this figure's face here, so you can see what high relief that is in and how it's almost totally released from the background stone. So that wraps it up. We have, just want to remind you, if you have any questions or if you want to find out more of the books or contact me, you can go to the website, guardiansofmichigan.com, or email me at guardiansofmichigan@gmail.com.